thanks very much, and good evening to you all. It's actually just noon here in the United States where I am on the East Coast, and I'm very excited to be with you all here today because what I'm going to be talking about is how we can make policy compelling and how do we convince people and broader audiences of the wisdom of being able to package content and research in a way that is effortlessly understandable and comprehensible. And so for the past 10 years, I've worked in Washington, D.C. as the director of technology at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And there I led a department that sought to really reinvent what the think tank product and output was. I mean, for years and years and years and decades, think tanks would produce, say, 100-page, 200-page PDF or a book or whatever that would be nothing more than a paperweight that would languish on a lawmaker's desk. But for us, what we really wanted to push and change was the ability to create policy research and disseminate it in a way that was more accessible to everyone, including high-level policymakers. And so in my prior career, I was in think tanks for the past 10 years, but before that, I was a journalist. And I was trained to think of information in terms of stories. And when I was going to conferences and conventions as a newspaper journalist back in the mid-aughts, it was a really interesting time because I remember very clearly that there would be sessions and classes and seminars around the question of, well, are people's attention spans long enough to go beyond the jump on the front page of the newspaper? And so the same debate has been happening within policy world, which is, well, are people really into it? Do they have an attention span long enough to digest complex policy issues? But really the issue underlying this, of course, is it's not so much a matter of attention spans or the length of them anymore, but really we need to do a better job of getting attention. And that involves being more smart, more strategic about visual communication and understanding how the modern digital landscape works. So what you're seeing here on my screen right now is a picture of Admiral Harry Harris. He was the commander of PACOM under the Obama administration. And he's pointing here to a satellite image that we obtained at CSIS. And so the great irony of this photograph, of course, is that it's quintessentially a DC photograph. Because of course, Admiral Harris, one of the highest ranking military officials in the government at the time, had access to this set of imagery. And what you're seeing here is a picture of an artificial military base that the Chinese Navy built in the South China Sea. And so this has been happening for years and years and years. Basically, the Chinese, what they have done is they take these giant sand trawlers, they ship them out into the middle of the South China Sea, and they pour tons and tons of sand on these coral reefs and convert them into these military installations with runways, helipads, missile batteries, barracks, and so on. And so this has been a serious national security issue for many years. And the military knew of this, of course, and this was taken in 2015. You're seeing a base that's known as Fiery Cross Reef. And up until 2015, the public didn't really know about this set of issues. They didn't really know what was going on in the South China Sea. Of course, the intelligence apparatus knew about it, but the public didn't really have an idea visually or otherwise what was going on here. And so because we knew the locations of these bases, we asked a company, back then it was called Digital Globe, now it's known as Maxar Technologies, to send their commercial satellites over these locations and take pictures. And so for the first time ever, we saw firsthand what was actually happening here. This was in many ways a wake-up call to the researchers at CSIS, because then they really understood, really fundamentally understood the whole concept of a picture is worth 1,000 words. Because the public at large saw this, they said, oh wow, this is what the Chinese are doing. And for them to look at this, it was, you couldn't misunderstand it. It couldn't be lost within the annals of a 100-page PDF report that very few people had access to. And so you can see here these images that we obtained. They grace the front pages of the New York Times and other major newspapers around the world. You could see there on the left the quote from Jeff Dyer, a journalist for the Financial Times, saying really concretely that the public release of these images really changed not only the understanding of this issue among high-level policymakers, but also within the broader public. And now in this modern era that we inhabit, the impact on the public debate and the public understanding has a very strong effect on policymakers and what they're thinking about and what they're prioritizing. More broadly, though, I think what the major takeaway for this episode is this. Washington, D.C. is not great at telling narratives. And really the takeaway that the researchers started to realize was you need to be able to create stories, not repositories. There is an overwhelming trend among think tank researchers and policy organizations in which they just want to cram as much information and as much data as possible into these releases or these publications or what have you. But because we were able to tell a very easily understandable visual narrative, they really started to understand fundamentally what the impact of doing more of a narrative-based approach to issues and policy sets were than just creating a data repository. So where are we now, and where is the digital landscape now, and how do we tell stories in 2021? Well, you know, when I have to explain this to people who are not fully on board with this concept or are not digital natives, I like to go old school a bit, and I like to show them just really how much has changed in the past 12 years. And you have to realize I got my master's degree in journalism in 2009. And it's only 12 years ago. And when we look at all the different changes in our landscape since then, you know, really, for the web developers in the room, responsiveness wasn't really a thing yet. We weren't talking about creating websites that would endlessly shift and mold itself to different screen sizes, whether it's your phone, your computer, your tablet, etc. We had very early versions of the iPhone, but Android wasn't really a thing yet. The Droid 1 came out at the end of 2009. Tablets weren't a thing yet. And look at all the things that we've developed and created for these platforms now. Twitter, I mean, could we even have imagined the policy impact that Twitter would have in the past 5 years? You know, much less a serious, everybody in the media at the time was saying, well, can you really communicate anything meaningful in 140 characters? Well, little did we know. Instagram didn't exist, TikTok didn't exist, major social networks that are now ingrained as a part of our daily lives in the way that they are, would not have even imagined that in 2009. And for any of my video editors in the room, of course, the gold standard for us at the time was Final Cut Pro 7. Now, for most of the people who are situated with that well, including myself, we're all on Adobe. Who thought that Adobe Premiere would become the gold standard for linear video editors? But that was just a decade of change. And if you look and compare that era to what we saw in the TV and the radio eras, the pace of change is increasing so fast that even in the next few years, I could hardly imagine the different platforms and the different practices that we're going to develop as a result of the rapid pace and change in technology. So one thing that I love to show is this particular story because it has so many implications for the future of storytelling. What you're seeing here is a story that the New York Times produced back in 2011. And at the time, it was hailed as a great creative and technical achievement for a newsroom. And if you permit me, I'm just going to show you what this actually looks like in practice. This is famously known as the snowfall story. But what is most interesting about this project is just how much this portended what was to come for digital communication. And you can see here, it's an amazing 3D visualization. You couldn't have imagined most news organizations being able to pull off this kind of fidelity. But for the folks at the Times, what they were angling at more than just a great, rich, creative story was they were also making a big bet on the future of how we consumed content and how we consume news content, rather than the newspaper, which was, our left to right or right to left and turning the page and so on. What the Times was making a bet on was that the future of news consumption was about scrolling. It was about consuming it on your phone, reading it on the train or the commute that you are on. And for them, it wasn't about left to right anymore. It was top to down. It was scrolling with your finger. It was using your mouse wheel to experience the beginning, middle, and end of this story. And so over the next decade, we've seen a lot of copycats of this format. We like to colloquially call this method scrolly telling. And I'm not trying to be cheeky or vulgar with this particular thing, but this was another pickup from the Huffington Post. The Huffington Post took the scrolly telling idea and they iterated upon it. And so what you see here is a really nice thematic explanation of how my generation, the millennial generation, has dimmer economic prospects than the generations Gen X, the boomers that came before us. And you can see it's very influenced by this 80s retro feel. Feels like I'm in an arcade. And then they do a few different flourishes. They make horizontal scrolling instead of just vertical. There's less text. It's more spaced out. There's more emphasis on visuals and animations. And so let's fast forward a little bit more. So we go into a more recent era, 2019. Here's the Wall Street Journal talking about how companies are privatizing space and making money off of it. And so you can see, I really want you all in the audience to pay attention to the stark difference, how far we've come in the 8 years since snowfall. This is 2011 here, late 2011 here. And when I go into the Wall Street Journal, this is where we are today, which, if you study it very closely, I'm going to scroll through it. I mean, it's just a totally different experience. What the New York Times was looking at in terms of design inspiration and what came before and what was there for precedent was the newspaper and newspaper layouts. But now you see outlets like the Wall Street Journal and others taking a whole lot of influence, not just from news, but from other industries as well, entertainment, gaming. And what you're seeing here is, you're not seeing the columns of text anymore. You're seeing these brief explainers that's saying, here's what you're seeing. And the visuals speak for themselves. And indeed, this is going beyond just the explainer or the brief or anything like that. You're even seeing opinion pieces, op-eds, being nothing more than elaborate visualization. So here's another one recently from the New York Times talking about economic opportunity in the United States and how this breaks down. And so you can see here a bubble chart showing the life expectancy at birth by metro area in the United States. And you can see here, the New York City area where I reside, high life expectancy, greater population. You can see that Minneapolis, St. Paul on the Midwest, a bit more of a median. And again, you see the same kind of theme here. Short textual explanations, but the visual speaks many, many words. Okay, so that's where we are now. And you're also seeing think tanks take up this mantle, this idea of scrolly telling, and thinking about how we package reports differently. And you can see here a really great example of something we produced back in 2017 called Turning Point. It was really a really seminal project for us because it took advantage of this scrolly telling format, taking not just this thick report text and only staying alone with text, but also integrating different visuals, rich visuals like photographs, videos, and interactive maps. But you would be surprised because there are a lot of outlets and a lot of policy organizations in DC that still don't quite get it. They don't understand it. And what you're seeing here is the top half of a report about the future of employment. This was published pre-pandemic. And what they're getting wrong here, this is from the Council of Foreign Relations, what they're getting wrong here is that they're not organizing around narrative. Now, I've had people say, well, maybe they're organizing it around outreach to the press. The press is just going to want specific graphics. But you do not, even the press and even journalists, they don't want to consume content in these arbitrary buckets of mediums, right? You want to experience a story. You want to see the beginning, middle, and end. And what CFR did in this particular example is they did it by the medium type. And if I was looking for information about the future of employment, I want to find the topically relevant stuff to me. I don't want to just see, oh, well, I'm looking in this particular instance for data visualizations about the future of employment. No. I want to know what CFR believes about how AI and automation is going to change jobs in the future of work in 20 years. So some other lessons, big lessons that we took away from this, the reality is that you cannot achieve this level of fidelity just by adopting a myriad of fancy tools. You can't just say, we're going to put 10,000, 20,000 euros to buying these map making things and graphic creators and so on and so forth. That does not equate to a digital strategy. You need to think about things more holistically and really ditch this trend where we're specializing the content. It's just content. And the more we try to differentiate it by saying like it's e-reports or digital reports or whatever, this is a wrong-headed way of thinking about it. You're just doing research. You're just producing stories or content. I'll put it to you all this way. What isn't digital these days? What are we experiencing that is print only anymore? Do we need to even differentiate that? And if we're not doing anything digitally, then what are we doing really? Just really be aware that multimedia was very much an invention of the news industry, right? Newspaper industry, right at the tail end of its height. I joined the newspaper industry in 2006, right about when everything started falling apart for newspapers in the United States. And we started saying, well, we're doing multimedia reporting. But the reality is, if you look at any big news website now, the New York Times or others, it's just reporting. It's incidental. It's part of their natural way of doing things. And just to reiterate again, we're looking for topical information. Unless you're going to a very specialized website like Flickr or YouTube, you're looking for videos or photographs respectively. But for most of us in the audience, if you're running a policy organization, a nonprofit, advocacy, what have you, users are generally going to your websites and digital properties looking for information about topics, not because you've dressed it up in any special way, whether it's video, multimedia, whatever. They want information, they want it delivered well, and they want it explained in terms of an easily understood narrative. So I borrowed from some colleagues in the United Kingdom, cast from clay, and this graphic is really great to take in because this shows you fundamentally at the root of like how think tanks especially have thought about their research product and how they're communicating that product more broadly. Because everything in the old school way centered around this nexus of the report. The researchers, and I'm hoping some of you in the audience can really empathize with this struggle, the researchers would go off into their corner, they wouldn't really talk to anyone except themselves, and then about a week or 2 weeks out from when they were publishing it, they're like, all right, we've got a report, we're ready to go. Communications, what can you do with this? And everything flowed out from the report. And comms and any media team, they weren't really well integrated from the get-go, so they weren't really well prepared. They didn't understand the topic. So everything that flowed from the report, whether it was the videos, the tweets, the social media, the launch event, the live stream event, whatever, it's all just a big scramble. It's not well thought out. And this is the old way of doing things. And so you could see here, this is kind of the flow chart of how we dealt with these kinds of issues, is that, oh no, panic, the report's coming out, now we got to figure out how to make it digital. But really where we need to move in terms of policy organizations is we need to recenter our focus here. We need to focus on what is the story? What is the central narrative that we are focusing on here? And then everything from there flows outward. And this requires a holistic integration across the organization. It can't be a siloed waterfall process where the research is done, then it's handed off to comms, then it's handed off to legislative relations or whatever. Everybody needs to be involved in cycles, and there needs to be an understanding, even if the data has not all been obtained yet, there needs to be an understanding of where this is going, generally where it's going. And that, sure, the research and the data might shift a little bit, but all the byproducts of the research flow out from that narrative. The report then, instead of being the nexus of it, becomes one of those byproducts. And the print report and the PDF, it's still going to be around, but we have to understand that it is one of many lanes that we are constructing. It is not a zero-sum engagement where somebody just reads one thing or engages with one thing. You need to create a broad road that's going to influence multiple different levels of public society. And the report, of course, it's a traditional output. It's going to influence the people who are very into the issue, who know a lot about the issue, and want to advance the research narrative and data. But the other things, you're going to be engaging with audiences. They're going to have different levels of interest and different levels of expertise. But this all comes together in a broader holistic strategy that reaches out to the broadest possible base. So how did we do this at CSIS? I want to bring this back to my own experience and talk about what we were particularly good at, because I will level with everyone here. There is no one-size-fits-all strategy. CSIS was a very national security, defense-first focused think tank. And for their content, what was most effective was to focus on geopolitical representations. And the best way we found to do that was through mapping and satellite imagery, as you saw from our South China Sea report. And so we started by releasing satellite imagery, looking at certain points in time and doing imagery analysis on it and saying, this is what was happening at any given point. But then we also expanded into creating interactive maps and cartographic representations of the data. What you see here on the right side of my screen is an accounting of the maritime borders and claims of Indo-Pacific nations. And so what I'm going to show you next was the culmination of these efforts. By 2020, we came up with a really unique way of talking about mapping and geodata related narratives. And what I'm about to show you is something I've lovingly called the map video or the map briefing. So it's about 2 minutes long. I'll let it play and let you consume one of the innovations that we came up with.
China is attempting to rewrite an ambiguous border. It's a relatively rare feat today for a country to stand up to China in defense of a smaller country. India is doing that today on behalf of Bhutan. The Doklam Plateau sits at a strategic location, really right at the corner of 3 different borders. China and Bhutan have a long history of trying to resolve a disputed border that dates back to an 1880 treaty that really had ambiguous terms in terms of where the border begins and ends between the 2 countries. After 24 rounds of talks, which were inconclusive, China and Bhutan were to have another round of talks in 2017. But instead of negotiators, China sent bulldozers. India chose at that moment to defend Bhutan's territory. They sent their own army across the border into Bhutanese territory to stop Chinese advances in building its infrastructure in the contested area that Bhutan had controlled. After a 72-day standoff, China pulled back, and for a lot of folks, that's actually where the narrative ends. But that wasn't the end of the story. While China slowed its incursion in that specific direction, actually since that time, as our satellite imagery shows, they've actually expanded their attempts to take over Bhutanese territory in other sectors of the disputed Doklam region.
What is remarkable when you look at the imagery is that this has to be one of the most remote, inhospitable, and rugged pieces of terrain anywhere in the world. The scope of the Chinese activity is also quite remarkable. You see switchbacks going back and forth on mountainsides. Barring any unforeseen circumstances, for the near future, it appears that the Chinese are going to continue their construction activity, spreading it further east and maybe a little south, and that they're there for the long term.
The strategic significance of the Doklam area, frankly, there is very little for Bhutan or for China necessarily, unless it comes to a hot war scenario. The area in normal peacetime, relatively uninhabited, no natural resources that we're speaking about, but during wartime could be very important for China's ability to cut off India's ability to connect to its northeast states. Now, the United States has really been reaching deep and trying to find new ways to cooperate and deepen our defense partnership with India. We don't have a treaty, and yet a lot of American strategic analysts that aren't so familiar with South Asia keep wondering why. What's the return on investment? But in reality, we are seeing that return on investment. It's just not in the areas that the United States considers really the front lines in the main struggles with China, with Russia, and other places. It's happening today. It's happening in the Himalayas. It's happening in the border area between India and China and Bhutan.
What you all saw there was a very effective piece of what I like to call policy storytelling. It had a very clear narrative arc where we had a beginning, middle, and end. We identified clearly what the issue and problem sets were. We showed the evidence for it through this compelling satellite imagery and 3D modeling. And then we also ended it with policy recommendations. And you see there Rick Rosso, CSIS's India chair, saying that as a result of the evidence and the problems that we've shown you, the United States should deepen its defense ties with India. And so this series of map videos that I created were really influential in terms of being able to tell audiences in a very clear and compelling way in 2 to 3 minutes why they should care and what we should do about it. So that's all I had for this afternoon. Glad you joined me.